back to our Illegal Drugs and Opioids in Indian Country series, webinar series. I want to thank SAMHSA for providing the funding for this opportunity. I want to thank our Native Connections program for and our HPOG and our EPI program, Great Plains programs, for helping to partner and collaborate in this session, or in this whole series, not just this session. I want to, a little few housekeeping. I'm sorry, I got a catch in my throat today. A few housekeeping things to take care of. If you could please hold your questions until the end of our presentation today. And we'll get to those, or you can put them in the chat box, and whenever, or not the chat, but the Q&A box, which should be located at the top of your screen or at the bottom of your screen. It has Q&A, and you can just type your questions in there, and then we'll get those to Dr. Sorry, cattail in the way. I'm not even going to say it again, Dr. Denise. It's
Dr.
a beautiful
D.
name.
My students call me Dr. D. That's good.
Okay. So I want to welcome everybody to Historical and Intergenerational Trauma. I'm so excited today to have Dr. D, who is an enrolled member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa in Belcourt, North Dakota. She's been involved in education for 40 years as an elementary teacher and principal, earning her bachelor's, master's, and doctorate degrees from the University of North Dakota. Dr. D is a board member and past president of the National Native American Board School of Healing Coalition. Dr. D is an award-winning author of an academic book, Stringing Rosaries, about the Native American boarding schools. And I'm so excited to have you here today, and I'm looking so forward to your presentation, Dr. D. Thank you for joining us, and I'm going to turn everything over to you. I will start sharing my screen and for your presentation, and you just let me know when to click through, okay?
Mingwich, Stacy. Buju anin, Wabishka bene sawana kwat, Ikwe dijina kaz, Ashijak nado dame, Mikanak wajun and Dunjiba, Mingwich kakina awaya, Denise Lajmadir. And my Ojibwe name is Thundercloud Woman. My clan is Crane Clan, and I am from Turtle Mountain, and I live by a cozy cottage on a lake here on the reservation. I'm retired as an educator, but still very active in education, of course, within the community and the tribe and nationally. Before we move on, I'd like to go to the second slide, and I'll have all the participants read this. This is important. Some of it looks like, well, I hope you can see it all. But some of the issues that I'm going to be talking about, sexual abuse and the abuse in general that happen at boarding school, can trigger you. So just to be aware that some of this may be very hard to listen to. Okay, so I got involved in boarding school research after interviewing my father, my mother, and my grandfathers. All of my grandparents and many aunts and uncles were sent to boarding schools. So I started, it came off my dissertation that one of the themes in my dissertation of interviewing Native females and their path to leadership was that many of them had been sent to boarding schools, and they were all like 60 years old and older. So I started doing research as a professor at NDSU, an education leadership professor. So if you can go to slide 3. I'm just, this is Fort Taunton, the 8th grade graduation. One of my grandfathers is in this photo. He's the top to the far right. And he looks a lot older than what, maybe a 13-year-old would look like, but that's what happened in boarding schools. You just got put in whatever grade when you entered, because many people didn't enter boarding school like right at 1st grade. On the next slide. This is my grandfather, my father's father, and his sister Martha, and they were sent to Fort Taunton boarding school. And you can see the uniform that he had to wear. It comes off of Richard Pratt, military style. And it was usually the girls at the boarding school that had to sew the uniforms. Because I had asked once, where did the military get such tiny uniforms? Well, the women were taught domestic work. So they made these uniforms there at Fort Taunton. I did find recent research that Grandpa Ben and 4 others snuck out of school and started rabble rousing with some of the animals in the, raising heck with animals in the barn, and he got kicked out of school. I hadn't realized that, but this is from 1898. Next slide. This is my mama. She's on the far right with the one with her arms down, and some of her friends. And I had a harder time finding her research because she died when I was, she died in 1977. So all I know is that she went to boarding school in, she went to Wapton, and she went to a boarding school in South Dakota. And she didn't speak a word of English when she went to boarding school. And then the nuns would lock her in the closet. And she said, I don't care. It was nice and quiet in the closet. So when she'd come home to be speaking English, and my grandmother would tell her, talk like a human being, talk our tribal language. And then she'd go back to boarding school and get beat up by the nuns again. She never spoke her language again, but my grandmother raised us and lived with us. So grandma would speak our tribal language, Michif, a mixture of French and Cree, and she did speak Chippewa. She didn't like English. And then my mother would answer in English. So that's how they communicated until my mom passed away. Next slide. So this is my father. I'll talk more about him later. He was stolen. It's called the stolen generation. He was sent in 1925, literally stolen from an old couple that was raising him because his mom died in the 1918 flu epidemic. So they hid him, the old Cree couple that raised him just south of Belcourt here. They hid him till he was 9 years old from the Indian agent. And finally they were threatened with loss of their food would be taken away from them, even their wood, and and North Dakota gets 80 below zero wind chill, they would have died. So they had to let him go. So he didn't speak a word of English. He spoke pure Cree, and so he's here. He's in the second row, 1, 2, 3, the fourth one over, little boy. But they were considered orphans. I mean, second from the right. I mean, the fourth from the right. Sorry, 1, 2, 3. Yeah, there he is. Yeah. So I did some research at Seattle Sandy Point has a federal research there archives, and that's where I found his records and the letters that were sent from home. I just sat there and just totally wept. The letters are so sad. They were so, he didn't go home for 4 days. I mean, for 4 years. They kept him there along with his sister. And the next slide. Okay, this is the dorm that the little boys were on the top floor. And I remember him saying that some of the kids died, some little boys died. And I said, what happened? And they died in their beds at night, overnight. And he said that they just died. So now we know that that's failure to thrive. The boys were so lonesome they would stop eating. And he also said that for their chores that they had to scrub the floor with kerosene. And it was a wood floor. How crazy is that? It's a miracle that they survived. Okay, so that's a little bit about my family and why I got into boarding school research. So let's see. So I'll give a real brief history of boarding schools. The United States Federal Indian Industrial or Boarding School Policy has been a collaboration of the Christian churches and the federal government since its earliest inceptions. Efforts led to the passage of the Indian Civilization Fund Act of 1819. The predominant view of the time was that either those sons of the forest should be moralized or exterminated. That's a quote. In other words, our only 2 choices were extermination or civilization. The federal government paid churches to run Indian schools, which became instruments of cultural genocide. The Bureau of Catholic Indian Missions, created in 1874, established boarding schools on and off reservations. So if you want to go to the next slide. So I'll let you read these. These are all of the churches through our research, and this list comes out of the Native American Rights Fund. They published a document called Trigger Points, and I'll show you the site towards the end of the presentation. So the Quakers are the only ones that has worked with the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition to give us a list of their schools that they ran. They were horrified to find that they had run boarding schools, but they did. So we're having a hard time struggling to find boarding schools from all the rest of these Christian denominations. And I'll talk a little bit about the map that I've developed and the research that I've done, trying to find boarding schools in general, and then listing who ran them, including, of course, the federal government. Okay. President Ulysses Grant announced his Indian peace policy on March 4th, 1869, declaring the proper treatment of the original occupants of this land, the Indians, is one deserving of careful study. He favored a course toward that which tends to their civilization and ultimate citizenship. His policy allowed religious denominations to undertake the work of civilizing the Indians. So there was no separation of church and states when it came to boarding schools. The government decided it was too expensive to continue to wage attempted genocide. The only good Indian is a dead Indian. That was Sheridan. Each campaign was costing close to $1 million. So assimilation became a method to deal with the Indian problem. In March 1891, Congress authorized the Commission of Indian Affairs to make and enforce by proper means such rules and regulations that will secure the attendance of Indian children of suitable age and health, a school established and maintained for their benefit. 2 years later, Congress authorized the Indian Office to withhold rations, clothing, and other annuities from Indian parents or guardians who refuse or neglect to send and keep their children in some school, a regional portion of the year. So the government determined a minimum of 4 years. A large portion of students were in schools up to 12 years without home visits. So that's what happened with my father. They were going to keep any kind of provisions away from the old couple that were raising him if they didn't send him to school. And he was there for the minimum of 4 years. And I have letters that were begging them to let him come back home, that we had established some schools here out in the bush and a day school that they could be, sent to school here if they were brought home. Okay, slide 9. So this is the first federal off-reservation boarding school, and there's a whole big backstory with Richard Pratt and how he came to take over this military base site and started as a school. So again, he was a military man. He fresh off of the Civil War, and he worked with Indians in Florida, and he wanted to experiment to see if Indians could learn to work and could learn the language and could be educated. So the government allowed him to take over Carlisle, Pennsylvania, the barracks there. So it was started in 1879, and this is a pretty famous shot of the kids at the school. Look at those babies. Look how young they were. If you have kids or grandkids that are 4 or 5 years old, if you can imagine someone knocking on your door right now and ripping them away for 4 to 12 years that you never saw them again, and they didn't even recognize you when they went home. It's called the returned. My father, when he came home, he was now 14, 15 years old. He just couldn't fit back in the reservation life or with his father was still alive, even though the old couple had died, and his father brought him back home, but he ran away. He ran away and started working the rodeo system in Montana. He just couldn't fit back in, and so many of the kids couldn't fit back in home, and they're called the returned. So, and I've been there. I've been to Carlisle, Pennsylvania quite a few times. That building is still standing. It still has Richard Pratt's office. It is now a a government war office. When you go in there, it's like it says war something, as you, maybe those of you that have been there could remember. Some of the barracks are gone. Some of the dorms that the kids stayed in, but it's still standing, and you have to have special permission to go in there. To go in there, but I was allowed to just walk around. I had a friend that worked nearby at a museum that brought me on a tour. Pretty sad. There's still stories of spirits there. Spirits of the children are still there. A lot of not good things happen there. They did have a jail there. It's very frightening looking, where they put kids. So there was, the only good Indian is a dead Indian, but Richard Pratt, the famous statement that he said is kill the Indian in him and save the man. So the goal of, okay, you can turn to 10. So this is what my father would have went through when he went to Chemawa. So it's Indian training school. So the goal here, it says my internet is unstable, so I don't know how to check it if I'm still.
We lost you for a moment, but we're back. So
we're back. Okay.
We'll be fine. We'll just wait for you.
Okay, am I back? Hello?
You're back.
Okay. Yeah, I had to reconnect. Sorry, this is okay. So he wanted to get kids off reservation, so that's why he started Carlisle. And the second school that was started was his friend Wilkinson started Chemawa Indian Training School. So there was one on the East Coast, and then this one is on the West Coast, started in 1880. It is still operating. It is the longest running boarding school that is still operating in the United States. There's about 54 other boarding schools still operating, but they are now taken over by tribal councils, or so there's a different focus for them. Not tribal councils, but tribal school boards. So they're not the same as how this started in the 1880. Okay, next slide. So this is the cover of my book. I did some research at Marquette Catholic University, where they have all the archives of the Catholic boarding schools. So this is one of the pictures that I found there. So next slide. Again, the Christian, and this is Little Flower School. This is in Fort Taunton. And they, of course, Pratt wants to show, a modernized, assimilated little native child talking to someone who was obviously staged in his traditional regalia, teaching him about, I suppose, about Jesus and about American value issues. So even though that this school was on a reservation, the people I interviewed that are in my book, the two men that went to this school said that they could see their families' homes from the windows, but for 9 months, they were not allowed to go home and they were not allowed visits, even though they were there on the reservation. One of the men talks about him and his buddy decided to run.
Looks like we lost her again.
Oh, still unstable. Okay, you still there? Next slide. Okay,
Dr. D, I think we had you on, I think you had your microphone muted. I'm sorry.
I did, and I didn't know it was muted.
Fine.
There. Boy, I wish I could switch to my other computer, but I don't know how to work the sound on it with even earphones. Okay, so this is a picture that I find very sad because as you'll see later on in the presentation, so many of these kids were being molested by priests, by even the headmasters, by the people that worked in the dorms, and even by some of the headmistresses that worked at the boarding schools. Okay, and then the next one, next slide. So throughout all of my boarding school research, the slide that kept popping up was the one at Carlisle with the hundreds and hundreds of kids. But every school has pictures like this. This is in North Dakota. It might be St. Mary's. I didn't mark where it's at, but it's a school, a Catholic school here in North Dakota. And so there's the same photo in every boarding school, and there was 400 boarding schools that I've come up with so far that had pictures of these kids that they had sent. Little tiny ones as young as 2, 3, 4 years old were sent to boarding schools. Next slide. And again, this is a North Dakota school. Look at the uniforms that they all were forced to wear. My dad said that the uniform was itchy and it was made of wool, and the shoes that were those buckle up shoes, and then there were sort of those big pants, that baggy pants that they had to wear. Of course, he wasn't used to wearing shoes like that, so he said they really hurt his feet. They pinched his feet. So I'm going to talk about the map right now, and I don't have a slide for it, but if you can just click out of the slides, I can show the map that's in the book. Well, that's the next slide. If you can just show. So the book, Stringing Rosaries, what my editor did was put a pull-out map of boarding schools. And I was so pleased with how they did this. So the history behind this is I was involved in the Truth and Reconciliation in Canada they've been working since like 1996 to document the boarding schools and document the horrors that happen in the boarding schools. So they had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I went up there as an outside international observer to one of their sessions of recording people that had stories to tell. And at dinner, working dinner that night, the three commissioners looked at me and they said, well, how many boarding schools does the United States have? And I couldn't answer. No one had ever asked the churches how many boarding schools they ran. No one had ever asked the government, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, how many schools they ran. So Native American Rights Fund sent a FOIA to the BIA in DC asking them to list the boarding schools they ran. And that was back in 2011, and we still haven't heard back from them. They don't even know. So I took it upon myself to like a 12-year journey to research and look for boarding schools. And that's what this map is about. The map in the book has 366 schools that I found, vetted, and I found 20 more since then. So if when the book goes into its next publication, we'll update the map. But it's tedious research. It was hard to do the research. One school in Oklahoma, they started out with 22 students and they were all happy. I can't remember the denomination. And then a month later, the document said that all the kids had died of black measles. So, but I still have that school listed because it was still started as a boarding school, a missionary boarding school. So we need more research. People have emailed me and said, well, can you tell me more about the Wittenberg boarding school in Wisconsin, where my grandparents went? But all I know is that it's a boarding school. And I tried to list the years, and that's all the information that I gathered at that time. So the National Boarding School Healing Coalition has recently come into a huge grant, and they're hiring researchers to do just that, to start researching documents and archiving documents and scanning digitally documents at some of these boarding schools. So we still have a lot of work to do. So so my research for the book is called a qualitative interview research. I went through and I put something in the newspapers and tribal newspapers, anyone that wanted to be interviewed about their boarding school experiences. And I went to their homes or wherever they were comfortable with, and I interviewed them. And then we do something, qualitative researchers, we have to sort of see what themes rise to the top. It's a long, complicated process. So these are some of the themes that came out of the interviews. And there's 16 interviews in the book, but I interviewed more people, and I'm still interviewing anyone who wants to be interviewed. So the boarding school survivors experienced loss of identity, language, culture, ceremonies, and traditions. They experienced loss of self-esteem, loneliness due to loss of parents and extended family, feelings of abandonment by parents, feeling lost and out of place when they returned home. Survivors experienced corporal punishment and forced child labor, hunger, malnourishment, sexual and mental abuse. Survivors experienced unresolved grief, mental health issues, relationship issues, and alcohol abuse, and probably still now drug abuse. Survivors expressed that they felt they had an inferior education. So I'm going to read from the book some of the words from the survivors that I interviewed. So be aware some of this could be tough to hear. So one of the things that was very common, and my mother talked about this, they'd make you kneel on a broomstick if you were bad. Oh God, that hurt. And you better not move because they come over and pull your hair or slap you in the face. So some of the discipline, my parents disciplined us kids like the way they were disciplined at boarding school. And you think about it, if they were at boarding school for most of their lives, where did they learn parenting skills? They didn't. My father didn't. He went to boarding school, he came home, he ran away, he went to CCC camp and then World War II, and then came home and got married. he had no parenting skills. It was just the harsh abuse at boarding school. And the same with my mom. So my mom, when us kids would get on her nerves, she'd yell at us to go to our corner and kneel. We didn't have to kneel on a broomstick, but we had to kneel for 30 minutes at a time. And Dad had a belt, just like he was almost killed at a boarding school. And I'll talk about that in a bit. So kneeling, when kneeling on a broomstick, and sometimes they have a circle where you'd have to put your nose in the circle, that's called stress torture. It is something that our military uses on prisoners. So sex abuse was one of the hardest things I had to ask about, and I was very careful in talking to these elders about their experiences. Almost all of them said they had never told anyone about their sexual abuse at the schools. And one lady said, "I don't know why I'm telling you." And she was whispering. She's in a huge house by herself, but she was whispering to me. And I said, "I know why, because I asked." So you have to know the right questions to ask an elder. And in the back of the book, I have the questionnaire, the question protocol that I used for interviewing these elders. So many of it is, I say that boarding school is America's best kept secret, but among Native people, the sexual abuse at boarding school is also a best kept secret. One elder, he said, "My story is back here," meaning in the back of his mind, and I will never tell anybody. So I can almost guarantee that he had been sexually molested in boarding school, and they become ashamed and embarrassed to tell their story. So this was a young girl. I remember having to serve the priest wine, but never in the wine hall. I remember being brought to the priest's room, but I never really remembered leaving. You know, I'd wake up and I never thought about it. Now that I think about it though, what did they do? Get me drunk? Well, you know, they want a bunch of young girls serving them wine anyway. Why would they want? I was 6 years old. I have a lot of problems down there, you know. Then the priest, not a nun, would take me to the doctor, drive me there in his car. Let's see. There. Okay. Oh, here it is. I was molested by the priest. I don't like to talk about it. It was 2 different priests. Sometimes one would come and get me out of my bed. Or if we were in the gym to watch movies, one of them would come after me because nobody played with me. I was the littlest one in the school. They'd call me out of school and then would say, "Father wants to see you." And I'd say, "No, I don't want to go. You have to go." They'd pull my pants down and fondle me. There was no one I could tell. Couldn't tell the nuns. I haven't told anybody. I don't know why I'm talking about it now. I don't want to talk to a therapist. I would blame myself. I should have been more aggressive. She was 5 years old. She was blaming herself. There's one story. She was 5 years old. The nuns told her she had to help cook for the priest, and she broke an egg. So the nuns threw her down into the basement where all the food was stored and locked the door. She was down there, I think, for 3 days before they found her. And she had to be brought to the infirmary because she was so weak. So she said next time she got thrown down there, she said, "I'm no dummy." She opened up a can of tomatoes, I think, and she saw the boys running in the little window. So she'd pee and poop in this can, and they'd dump it out for her, and then she'd give them food. She'd sneak them food while she was down there. Sometimes the nun locked me in the pantry, would let me out saying, "Oh, I forgot you." So if we did something wrong, we were usually punished in a group. I have, I think, 6 scars on my back. They used to have a coat room. When you got punished, we'd all have to stand against the wall and grab those hangers and hold them up and stand there while they whipped us. We couldn't cry. If we cried, we got hit again, so we didn't cry. So he was talking with his brothers, and he just sort of asked, did any of the priests ever kiss you? And one of them did start telling a story, and he started to cry. So even the brothers that went to the same school had kept the secrets of their abuse. So of course we know that they cut hair, they cut the braids off right away. They used to cut our hair, shave our heads, said we had bugs, that we were dirty. We came from the res. A nun pulled him off of a counter, pulled him off, or I fell down and broke my collarbone. And that's why I got nerve damage in my left arm, because it was never taken care of. The kids didn't have good health care when they were there. So the boys started talking again. Any of those priests ever bother you? And his youngest brother said, they bothered me. They molested me. If I ever see that guy again, I'll kill him. There's one elder from here on the reservation, and he was at a school in South Dakota, St. Joseph's, and a lady there used to have them come out of the shower and lift up their towels and turn around, and she would fondle their private parts to make sure they were clean. She also would punish them by having them run down to the river and pick a willow switch and run back. Well, this guy said he was running down to the river and he ran into a bunch of rattlesnakes. He jumped in the air and he jumped over the rattlesnakes and got his stick, and then wondered how he was going to get back. But he managed to scare away all the rattlesnakes and come back with his stick, which she beat him with. So another thing that happened at Catawitha, which is in Sisseton, they've now demolished the Catawitha. They've just raised it, and it's now a park. But one of the boys, and there's something going around the internet that a lawyer from here found a document that stated that she would sell for $10. She would sell a boy to a family in New York or on the East Coast. So this, all four of my brothers got sold. The Jeffers family in Brooklyn, New York, and that's where they grew up. Never saw Jack before, never seen Jeffrey. He passed away. Roger came back, and he's in Sisseton right now. Right now, Roger says they were sold for $20,000, $5,000 a piece. Hard to believe that much money, but that's the figures that he had. So I think he's still in touch with the one brother, and the one brother that was sent out there is still out there. So I'll stop there. My dad's story is my healing journey. It's the last chapter in the book, but he talks about the gauntlet, which was pretty famous, started by Pratt, and it was throughout the Catholic schools, throughout all of the schools, and it was done in a different way. But he was caught teasing a headmaster and headmistress, and someone told on him, an older boy told on him, and they laid him over the bed and held his hands and his feet. And the boys lined up behind him, and they had to hit him with a belt. And Dad said it was studded with little studs, and on his bare back. And he said he passed out from the pain. And if any of the boys let up and went easy on him, the headmaster said you would have to take his place. So that guaranteed that the boys would hit him pretty hard. He ended up in the infirmary, he said, for 2 weeks. He said he still has the scars from that beating. Now, I didn't see scars on his back growing up, but if my father says there's scars on his back, then there's scars on his back. They killed a boy from Browning, Montana, through the gauntlet. They ruptured his kidneys. So there's some other sexual abuse stories. I'm not gonna read them. It's hard on me. So there was physical abuse and torture. If you want to go to 16, slide 16. So there's a beating, abuse, the severe, the gauntlet, the stress torture, kneeling on sticks. There's documented starvation diets. My father was always hungry. The food that they served was often full of mold. There was a teacher documented at Bismarck boarding school that the ham or the meat that the lady was serving was green with mold, with rot. And her first day there, she went running back to the kitchen and said, "There's worms in the food that the soup you're serving the kids." And the cook said, "Oh, they're used to it." So there was accidents and death. The kids had to work half a day and go to school half a day. The schools did not have enough money to support to support the schools. They weren't funded and they were often overcrowded. So the kids had to do. They worked half a day in the kitchen, in the laundry room, out in the barn. They did the carpentry. My dad helped build buildings at Fort Totten. They put him into the carpentry. He was good at math, so they put him in to be a carpenter, and he did make a living for us kids throughout his life. He was a carpenter, but he's so smart. He had a high IQ when he went into the Army, and so he was an Army engineer. So I always think, what could he have been if he had been allowed to go to a regular school and maybe on to college? And like one of his friends here on the reservation got the first doctorate here on our reservation, maybe he would have been able to get a doctorate too. So there's deaths in the laundry room, kitchens, the barns. They were maimed. They were often hit with the sharp edge of a ruler and broke fingers that weren't repaired. So this here, one of the interviewees that I interviewed, well, actually it's a friend. She told me for years that her father had been thrown in the dungeon at Fort Totten, and that he wouldn't speak English, and that when he was in the dungeon, he would sing Sundance songs at the top of his lungs. So I spent a lot of time at Fort Totten, and the people that run it's now a historical site. Yeah, it was a fort, of course. The Army was there. Custer was there just before he went on down to his demise. Then they turned it into a federal boarding school. So they let me go to places at the fort where tourists weren't allowed to, because they're remodeling slowly but surely, using oil money whenever it's available. So in the boys' dorm, and he said it was under the boys' dorm, so we went rooting around the boys' dorm and back where the showers were and the sinks were. We went way back in a corner, and we found this. I found this, and the two young people that work there, we lifted up that wooden cover, and there was an old ladder that went down there, and I had a skirt on. I wasn't prepared, and flip-flops. I wasn't prepared to go down there, but both of them went down there, and I said, "Can you shut off your lights and I'll put the cover on? It has to be pitch black," according to the people I interviewed. And sure enough, so the gal made it back up the steps, and then the young man, he got up a few rungs and the ladder broke, and then he got up a few more rungs and all of them broke. I about had a heart attack. I had to sit down. My heart was beating so hard. We pulled him out. And later on, there were two other elder men that I showed this to, two elder Fort Totten Dakota men. And later on, they told me that probably the spirits of those boys that had spent time in there wanted to keep that young man down there with them. And there's all kinds of, again, they have stories of in the dead of winter when it's closed and hearing running upstairs in the boys' dorm and so on, seeing faces of little girls in the girls' dorm, and so on. The next slide. So there's more than one dungeon there. There's this one, and then one of the men that wouldn't let me interview him that said, "My stories will stay back here." He told me about another dungeon he was put in across Cavalry Square, across from the boys' dorm. So again, they let me go, and we pulled up this rug, and sure enough, there was this dungeon, and we lifted it up, and there were stairs down there that I could walk down in. We had to hunch over, but he was thrown in there. So that's three dungeons. I don't know what they were originally used for, maybe some kind of storage or something, but they were, during the school days, they were used to throw kids down, keep them down there. So 18. So this is at Chemawa. I spent a lot of time at Chemawa, just after, because it's still a school, but it's a modern school, and all the old buildings have been completely razed, but the cemetery is still there. So this is what it looks like right now. When I went there, there happened to be an older man, and he was cleaning the area. No one takes care of the cemetery. The school doesn't take care of it, so it's very heavily overgrown. I just sweep aside a lot of the weeds too. Most of the schools, have cemeteries. The kids died. He said his father said during 1918 flu epidemic that they just constantly were loading caskets onto trains trying to get the kids home. But there was, I think, 22 graves I counted for 1918. And there was about the same amount of, well, maybe, I can't remember how many that were there. I counted the years that my father was there. Because if he worked in carpentry, he probably had to build the coffins that he would bury these kids in. So they had the old cement headstones, but the BIA came and they raised them decades ago. And then they had the kids make these little flat plaques, probably so it would be easier to mow. But a friend, Marcia Small, she went in with a ground penetrating radar system. And she said there's a lot of graves that are unmarked. There's some graves that are on top of each other. There's a whole bunch of huge old fir oak trees that some of the roots are entangled in some of the graves, but there's also a lot of unmarked graves. So just as an aside, when I go to Carlisle, they have now repatriated, 1 or 2 tribes have come and gotten their babies back from the Carlisle cemetery. And now I think the Cheyenne and one Alaskan tribe is going to come and get their babies repatriated back. So some tribes have said, no, our spirituality says they have to stay there, but other tribes want their kids back. And the horror of that cemetery also had been moved they wanted to put a parking lot. So they moved the kids, decades ago again. So when they dug up this one grave that the family thought was their son, there was two remains there, and neither one of them was their son. So it's a horrible story, sad story. Okay, so the legacy of boarding schools, if you want to go to 19, the next slide. The legacy of boarding schools is what's called historical trauma. Now, I had never heard this word before until I started researching boarding schools, and some of this comes out of the history from the research from the survivors of the Holocaust. Their children and their grandchildren are still experiencing something called epigenetics. So historical trauma is post-traumatic stress disorder, dissociative disorder, suicide, domestic violence, and sexual abuse that has happened historically. I tell a story of my great-grandmother, who I knew well. I'm in my almost 70s, so I knew my grandmother when she was almost 100 years old. And she talks about the Indian Wars. And then she sent her 4 boys, my grandfathers, to boarding school, and then my grandfather sent my mom to boarding school. So epigenetic, if they could take my blood or my DNA, they could see the trauma that has been handed down just historically through what's happened to Native people in the United States, the attempted genocide, and then the cultural genocide of boarding schools. So there's historical trauma and intergenerational trauma, which is what has been handed down to me and my family, and that includes the research on epigenetics. I don't know enough about epigenetics to talk about it, but hopefully someone else you can find out more information about that. And then there's historical unresolved grief. And I was interviewing my uncle who just passed away. He was 97 years old, talking about when he was at boarding school, and he got so angry at the nuns. He said that the nuns were so mean. He said they never did nothing unless they talked to the devil first. But he got so angry, I was afraid of him having another heart attack. So I stopped the interview. So that's unresolved grief. My father never talked about his boarding school until I interviewed him just before he died. Unresolved grief that had been carrying so many of our people, all Native people, just carried that grief inside of them. It's grief that has not been expressed, acknowledged, and resolved, and it can span against across generations. So this slide, I did a journal paper with Dr. Donald Warren, and some of you may know him. He's leading up the department. He works at UND. He's a medical doctor, and also heads up what is the program at UND? The training people to become masters in public health. So if you look at this slide, there's historical trauma that I just talked about, the attempted genocide. Then at the boarding schools, look underneath the boarding school experiences. Look at all of the experiences that happened to our boarding school people, our grandmothers, our grandfathers, our parents. And then he also looks at adverse childhood experiences. So he talks about WIC. He does a better job of talking about this than I do, but women, infants, and children, they encourage mothers to not breastfeed, to use formula, things like that. The food that is in there is sugared, sweetened cereals and so on. So he counts that as stressors. And then childhood stressors, the food distribution, also, he would be able to talk more about that. But look at the adverse childhood experiences. So beside what we're still living with in our generations today, and almost every Native person is, whether they realize it or not, are in this historical and intergenerational trauma and historical trauma. Then we have the abuse, neglect, substance abuse, and so on. So then that leads to chronic disease disparities, issues we have now with diabetes. Like my father had a wonderful diet because they were subsistent hunters and they had gardens. And then he went to Chamau and he was very, very skinny. They tried to fatten him up. He just couldn't eat that food. Plus he said, I just couldn't learn that language. He was beaten severely for not being able to speak English. So this is sort of an overarching, all the issues that we have of why we are the way we are today, I say, why we have the drug and alcohol and health issues that we do. It's has to do, starting with historical trauma, comes from a long ways back. Okay, so at the end of my presentation, what I usually do at this point is, if you want to go to 20, is, so this is all, can be very depressing, but Trigger Points comes out of Native American Rights Fund, and I encourage you to go to their website and download this. It's about over 100 pages, but it has my information along with a lot more information about boarding schools. It goes into a lot more in depth than what I can go through within an hour. But mostly too, what we need to talk about is healing, the National Boarding School Healing Coalition. We always ask ourselves, what does healing look like? Would healing be an apology from the government like Canada did? Canada, they said that, so many of them said it was a recognition of what happened to us. And then of course they had like $5 billion to do healing work, to set up healing in the communities, to take the stories. The churches chipped in, the different government programs chipped in a lot of money. When I started this in 2011, we had about $5,000 as a national organization to work with healing. And now recently they get a $10 million grant. I believe NABS did a one-time grant that they're going to continue trying to do healing work. But we have to ask each tribe though, what does healing look like to you? Would it be an apology? Some of my people said yes. It would be a recognition of what the hell they did to us. And the other people said, I can't ever get my childhood back. What's the use of an apology? So I'm all for an apology from the government. And but NABS is not focusing on that right now. They're focusing on other other issues that they have decided to focus on. So Deb Haaland, who's the Secretary of the Interior, and a few other people have introduced to Congress last year the Truth and Healing Commission on Indian Boarding School Policy in the United States Act. And I was so excited to see that. We want to see a commission go throughout the United States and do like what they did in Canada and start taking stories of what happened to them at boarding schools. It didn't pass Congress, but they're reintroducing it again this year. So with Biden being president, we have, and Deb Haaland being there, who is Native, Indigenous, we have high hopes for that. And I hope to be invited to sit in on that commission. So some other healing that we want to look at is reclaiming our history, cultural interventions, therapeutic healing, language, spirituality. You just saw that Representative Ruth Anna Buffalo introduced a law asking schools to teach Indigenous history. Wow, it's about time. It struggled, but it did pass. So I've been invited to be on ad hoc committee. I want to see boarding school curriculum developed that's specific to North Dakota. And I hope to be involved in doing that, which would be fantastic. So we need more education in this area. We need economic opportunities in general on the reservation. So these are really overarching that, and NARF, Trigger Points goes into more detail for each one of these, but this is what we feel we need for our healing. We need more research and scholarship. We need more if you're doing research on boarding schools. One of my friends who is working in Canada right now, Dr. Lou White, just for one school, just for Carlisle, they had a program called the Outing Program that, like my dad, was sent out to a farm to pick onions for summer. So and Carlisle would send them all over the state there to farmers or to domestic work for the women where there was no oversight. They're often abused in these places also. But some of them died when they were on the Outing Program. So her research has been going and finding the actual graves of kids that were on the Outing Program and got buried in these white towns. And again, the research was very hard on her. I mean, it was very hard emotionally. Oh, can almost get upset right now. So we need more research and scholarship, and we need more focus on family programs and focus on health and well-being, which many of the tribes are doing a good job of doing, but I'd like to see more healing and programs dedicated specifically to boarding school healing. Okay, ooh, that's it. And yeah. Okay, so now I am open. Oh, you want to, okay, let's do, okay, a few more slides, I'm sorry. Just real quick. I guess the slide of that shows stringing rosaries, that's all we need to show. The next one, yeah. Yeah, so the book is available. It's one of 7 national awards. So I'm very proud of this book and very thankful to NDSU for publishing this book. Okay, so now we can look at questions.
First of all, Dr. D, I am so I was emotional today anyway.
Yeah.
But yeah, that is really, and I heard you, and I wrote down several questions myself, and I'm sure our participants have a gazillion questions and comments, and I'm sure there's so many of us that have, we recognize this, from our grandparents, and I didn't even know that my grandfather was in boarding school. I knew my grandmother had been, and I think I was grown before I realized that he had been in boarding school, and because it was just never talked about ever. He never mentioned it. And he was a tough man. He was a, large stature, and, we didn't cross him, and but so I find really interesting is that he and my grandmother had 6 children. those 6 children all went to Catholic school. It wasn't boarding school, but it was Catholic school. And some of those, looking at them later, the ones that are still living, like I have an aunt, and she just like, well, that's just what the nuns did. And, she just like accepts it, and like, it's okay. And it's, it's not okay. Abuse is not okay.
Yeah. Yes.
But I had a couple of questions, and then I want to move into our participants. I'm sure that they have, like I said, a gazillion comments and questions. You mentioned at Chamawa having to have, at Carlisle having to have special permission. Like, why?
It's now a war school. So since 9/11, they've set up roadblocks. So you have to go in to a special building, and they do a background check. And you can go online and get your background check done ahead of time. But it usually only takes a few minutes when you're there to get a background check, and then you can make it through. So what happened when I went is someone just told me from the hotel I was staying at, they go to this street, take a right, take another right, and then take a right into the school. So that's just what I did. And the cemetery is right there in the corner. So looking at the cemetery, I took a right and went in, and wow, these spikes come up. There's a guy there that's supposed to be in a house, but he wasn't there. Pretty soon cars came. I was asked to get out of the car. They opened up my car, my trunk, and I was shook up. So you have to take the left and go into this building to get your background check, which I had done ahead of time, but I didn't know that you had to go into that building. But they are pretty strict about it. You can't. It would have tore up my rental car's tires pretty badly.
Oh, wow.
So it's because it's an operating war college right now. They're training people to be, I say warmongers. I'm sorry about that if you're in service, but they're training. That's where people go in the United States to train. This is called a war college. So yeah, so there's people walking around and very high level important people within the services of our United States that are there. But it's otherwise still a pretty quiet campus. There's not a whole lot of activity. There wasn't a whole lot of people walking around, but there was, we Donald Warren and I and Michael Yellowbird, a few others, we were there, and we posed in front of Pratt's building and raised our fists and say we're still here. Yeah. It's really.
And then you mentioned a school in Oklahoma. I'm just curious because that's where I'm originally from, Osage, and like I said, both my grandparents were in boarding school, and I was just curious what boarding school you were referring to.
Oh, I can't remember, but all I know is that in the map there are 78 boarding schools listed for Oklahoma alone.
Yeah.
78. So there's, and there's a lot.
One last question from me. Sorry, I don't mean to monopolize, but we still have quite a bit of time left. You interviewed survivors of boarding schools. Did you by chance, and I'm going to assume maybe they had all passed on by the time you started your research, did you interview anybody who was employed there?
Yes, and you bring up a very interesting, sad, both the women that, one of them didn't make it into the book, but another one, Hofda, these Native people that were employed there, from other people that I interviewed, they were some of the meanest people that beat these kids. So it was Native people that worked there that were part of those that worked in the dorm that made these kids, that whipped these kids with belts and made them kneel on broomsticks. What I figure is that they went through that when they were in boarding school. So then that's the way that they chose to discipline. So yeah,
and today we have lateral violence,
Yeah.
that we suffer from amongst ourselves.
There's one lady, I did interview one lady, and she had a good story. She had a good time, and there's issues with that. But anyway, she had a pretty mellow story, and I wanted to put her in the book, but she wouldn't let me. She said, no, you got too many rugged stories in there. But I said, but I want to balance the book by people who say that they had a relatively mild time there. And the issue with that is what often happened when these kids went to boarding school and they saw the horrible beatings, the horrific beatings. My father saw at Chimawa, the kids, the 4 boys ran away. They brought him into the cafeteria when all the kids were there. They threw rope over and they tied their hands together and they lifted the little boys up so that their feet weren't touching the ground. So he vowed to behave. He vowed to not run away. So a lot of the kids that said they had a good time at boarding schools, they sort of behaved because that was the only way they could make it through and to survive mentally and physically making it through. So you'll often hear, I had a good time at boarding school. So then they were treated differently by the nuns and priests and by the headmasters and headmistresses. But it wasn't that they were like sellouts or anything. It's because these poor babies, that's the only way they knew to survive and to not get half killed. And kids were killed, were beaten to death at these schools.
I want to read a comment here from one of our participants. I think we need intense trauma treatment centers for Indigenous people throughout the country at low or no cost. Also educate our Indigenous people who are willing to learn how to help our own people heal without soliciting the help of non-Indigenous people who think they know how to heal us. These facilities need to be top of the line and state of the art with the best therapies and facilities so that our people will feel like they are important enough for these kinds of facilities and important enough for the best therapies.
Wow, exactly. I've said that. I've been diagnosed with PTSD because of, that's why I have the healing journey. My dad ended up being a pretty violent alcoholic. So I've had a lot of therapy just to deal with being in that intergenerational trauma. But that's what I've said is that, so my counselors, none of them knew anything about this. None of them knew about boarding schools. And so I did find one in Moorhead. He's no longer practicing, but he was Native. And he sat there for like an hour, 2 hours and told me about me. He was incredible. He saved my sanity. He was Native. So absolutely, I say we need Native counselors, we need Native therapists, we need more Native people that are aware of our boarding school history and how just about everything that filters down from boarding school history, drug and alcohol abuse and spousal abuse, everything is from that intergenerational and historical trauma. We're getting an alcohol and drug center built here. I think it's on pause right now, but we're getting one built here. But that would be excellent to have therapists there that know more about this history, could go through some training about this history. And because when I was in Fargo, there was a lot of Native people on the streets, and I always wanted to stop and ask them, they're alcoholic or they were inebriated, and I always wanted to stop and ask them, what boarding school did you go to, or what boarding school did your parents or grandparents go to? Because I think it's still that history is still keeping us very unwell. That is a marvelous, wonderful comment.
I agree. It's so interesting because both of my grandparents went to boarding school. Both of my my mother and father-in-law, at least one of them, I don't know if the other one went to boarding school. But both my children, actually my daughter went to Chimawa, had kind of a rough time and came home. It wasn't, I didn't force them. It was really hard for me because I thought only bad kids went to boarding school, and it was when things were starting to change. My daughter went to Chimawa, my son went to Sequoia in Oklahoma. And so it was, quite a different experience. And both of them had different experiences from one another. But we have a couple more comments. One of our presenters said this presentation triggered a lot of feelings, and I agree. I'm sitting over here with a box of tissue and a froggy throat. Laura Hawkins says, is the book Stringing Rosaries available for sale? And she said she found it. And I had the same question, as if we could.
It's best to buy from the publisher, which is North Dakota State, NDSU Press, North Dakota State University Press. And also, but it's also sold on Amazon. And, I like independent bookstores like Zambros and Fargo are birch bark biting, birch bark. I'm a birch bark biting artist. Birch bark store in Minneapolis run by Louise Erdrich. Those are good independent bookstores to order the book from.
We have another question from that says, do you think that practicing non-Native holidays continue to keep us Natives in trauma?
Oh, wow. That's a good question. I've struggled with, raising my kids and my grandkids. They weren't raised Christian. I was, you talk about, we were forced to go to church. My dad never went to church, but he would rattle his belt at the bottom of the stairs. You kids get up, and he would bring us to church and then come pick us up. So I walked away from the Jesuit Catholic Church when I was 14, and I didn't get beat. I didn't get hit. I don't know why my parents, but they let me walk away. And I went on a long journey to find who I was as a Native person with our tribal spirituality here, the Ojibwe spirituality, still, Sundance, Sweat Lodge, ceremony, shake tent. I'm not initiated into midday, but I hope to be. So the holidays, the way I know my friends talk about it is, it is a time for family. We try to turn it into a time for family, like Christmas. I couldn't not let my kids and grandkids have Christmas because all their friends did, and I don't want them to, to be teased or anything. So it was a hard decision for me. Easter, I don't celebrate any of those, but of course, the Easter basket for the kids. So there are families that I know that are very strong in raising their kids to understand their tribal spirituality and not participating in those holidays. And yet I see people that are strong in midday, that lead midday ceremonies, but he has like 9 kids and they all celebrate all of the holidays. So it's got to be an individual family choice.
I agree with you. I have some friends and they don't celebrate Christian holidays. My kids did, but we also, I use those times as, I kind of put like the Native twist on it so far. And I'm not saying what I did was right. I'm just saying that's what worked for me and my little family. Is, it's a time for us to come together. Christmas, we talk about this is a time of giving and being generous. I mean, we're generous all the time, but we want to be generous to one another. Because so oftentimes we're helping others outside of our Tiwahe and Tioshwe. So we want to be generous to one another and just spending family time, just making that time for us. So I agree with you. It's an individual practice. An individual choice.
There's a chance to talk to the kids, like Thanksgiving. So we'll have the turkey and stuff, but I also have this book about Thanksgiving, the indigenous viewpoint of it and so on. I said, you guys are going to sit and read this. Okay, Kookums. Okay. I said, this is the Bible. This is, Jesus. I heard a Lakota medicine spiritual leader say that Jesus was one hell of a medicine man. So I said, this is a story of Jesus. So I tried to educate them on that side, and that this is why we're doing this, but this is also who we are as Native people.
Do we have any other questions or comments from any of our participants or any of our Facebook viewers? This has just been so, oh my gosh, I can't wait to get the book. I'm going to go actually to the bookstore and see if I can get it now.
Again,
we do have another comment here.
It's a pretty tough read, so just be aware. I give a.
Yeah, we do have a comment here. It says, I think there should be something specifically for Natives in Minot and other surrounding small cities such as Minot. Not all want to return home after receiving treatment. And then would Dr. D mind sharing your email? That was from Facebook.
D.lajmadir@outlook.com.
Brooke, can you put that in the chat? I love your name, Lajmadir, but I know I'm going to mess it up. I'm sorry, Brooke.
Wow. Okay. How do we address the trauma of our Native youth? Boy, I'm not a therapist or a counselor. Yeah, there is a lot of trauma. Again, it's programs, it's counselors trained. We have two wonderful trained female therapists here on the reservation that got their doctorates through the Insight program at UND. I think that they got their doctorates in therapy as psychologists, and they are wonderful in working with the youth in the schools. So we need more Native therapists, doctors, psychiatrists, and psychologists to work with these kids. So there still is a lot of trauma. You know, there's 76% unemployment here on my reservation alone. So a lot of poverty, the kids in poverty, a lot of alcoholism right now. I just lost my goddaughter to drugs, to meth. It's horrifying. So there's so much grief. You know, how do we just handle grief alone, along with all the rest of the issues that poverty brings, and the trauma of that meth has had here for our reservation. But we do have a lot of school counselors that are Native from within our tribe, our principals, our doctors and nurses, lawyers are from our tribe. So there are lots of people here on my reservation alone that I know of, and I know it's the same with other reservations that are trained to help our Indigenous youth.
Our condolences to you on the loss of your goddaughter. I know it's really, really that's a tough and
yeah. Well, we've got these cartels that just drive straight here to the reservation to sell this crap. You know, I went to a workshop, you know, last year. I don't know if it's one that you guys put on, but it was in Rapid City or a couple years ago, and I was just floored at, you know, they listed all the cartels and it showed the map of the reservations that they deliver to. So they just drive right through the res, or they mix it up at the casino. And we have what is it, trafficked women that go through here. So things that I had no idea. You know, I'm sitting here in my happy little cozy cottage, not knowing any of this stuff is going on around me, because I'm not involved in that world. But it's horrifying.
It is.
Did I mention today I'm wearing red for the Missing Murdered Indigenous Women Awareness Day? President Biden has declared this. He has a declaration, if you look on the government website. So how incredible, I mean, how wonderful that we have him as president, that he recognizes what's happened to our people. And we actually have a missing murdered Indigenous women that was found in a storage unit in a like a freezer that has been missing for quite a while here. So now the tribe and the family is bringing her home. So at least they have closure. But that certainly struck close to home.
It is. I did miss a couple of comments over here, and I apologize for that. But we someone mentioned that we here in Rapid City, we have the Birdcage Bookstore and Mercantile in Rapid City, Lakota and woman owned. They may have your book as well. That was where I was going to go try to get it. And then another comment, as someone who attended Catholic school, I am so disappointed and angry we never learned about this. And you know what? I agree with that. You know, I actually know some and worked with some a Catholic organization, and they, first of all, they wanted me to do a presentation on this right here, intergenerational trauma and historical trauma, and I was in no way qualified to do that, and I did not feel comfortable doing that. But it was kind of like one of those not given the opportunity to, well, I didn't have an option. And then when I did, and just talk about the reality of it, it was not well received, you know. So it's because I'm one of those people, I'm just going to call it what it is, you know.
Yeah.
We have some more comments here. It says, sorry for your loss, from Tina Semino. Camino. In Santee, we cover implicit memory. And what was the name of the book, Tina? It's called Stringing Rosaries.
Yeah.
We have another question here. It says, do you know if suicide was part of any Native cultures for any reason? How did we as Natives address suicide with our tribal members? Is suicide a non-Native concept?
I don't know. I've never heard of, we had such a strong spirituality, and we had elders, we had such a kinship. You would know that, especially as being Lakota or Dakota. Such a strong kinship. I'm just off the top of my head, I've never heard of it, suicide amongst tribes.
I haven't either, and I actually am Osage. I'm not Lakota or Dakota.
Okay.
But I always, the way I look at it and the way I, try to talk to young people is that, everybody has a role within the Oyate. Everybody has a role within their Teoshpai and their Tuahe. And so if you take yourself out of that role, then the loop becomes broken. Everything's circular, right? And so if a piece is missing, then it's broken. There's the broken link. So I don't know. That's a good question.
Even right now, LGBTQ, Indigenous, Native, our youth period are struggling. But we had two-spirit people. In our culture, I can speak for Ojibwe, and they had a role. They were storytellers. They kept our stories. Some tribes, they were the water carriers, which, water is life. So they were highly honored. So there wouldn't be any suicides or trauma amongst our two-spirit people, because they were absolutely accepted. Like you said, they had a role within the tribe. And everyone had a clan, and the Bear Clan or the Buffalo or the I'm Crane Clan. It's a leadership clan. So we all had our roles, and we were part of taking care of that tribe, like you said, as a family, as a whole.
I agree with you, and I want to apologize to our other panelists and our participants. I did not want to monopolize this conversation. So if anybody would like to speak, please feel free to do so.
Well, I want to thank you for listening. I promised these survivors, one of them said, please tell the world what happened to us. So even though these are hard on me, it took me a year to be able to give this without breaking down, without crying. But I promised them that I would continue to tell the world what happened to them. And I will until I can no longer speak, or until I'm dead. I will continue passing this on. So I want to thank you for the invitation to speak today, and encourage all of you. Like you said, you didn't hear about this in high school. I call it America's best kept secret. It's not in the history books. It still isn't. If it is, it's a paragraph. So please pass on what you've learned today. Share the information that's been shared here. Share the book. Do more research, and just spread the word in honor of these survivors who were brave enough to tell their story. Some of them, they asked to remain anonymous because they still just couldn't tell their names and let the world know their names. But about half of them did give permission to use their names because they want the world to know what happened to them. So it's still an issue, a big issue in Indian country. It's a big issue that's keeping us not well. So we have a lot of work that we need to do, which is boarding school healing. So thank you so much, Miigwech.
Well, thank you so much for being here with us today and for sharing your wisdom and your, oh gosh, it's just like overwhelming. And
Yeah,
You
it
know,
is.
it almost makes things understandable, you know, when we look at our societies today. And I just want to thank you. I want to ask everybody to please complete the survey over in the chat box. Dr. D, do you mind? I know that most of your presentation is photos. Do you mind if we post that on our website?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you again so much. And
Yep.
everybody, please remember your Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Day, and just take a moment to say a prayer for those women who are out there, and girls, and even young men or
Yes.
old men or whatever that are,
Yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
that go missing, you know. So I want to thank you. I'm going to ask that you join us again next week when we're going to talk about opioid awareness. Dr. D, I can't thank you enough, and I'm so happy to make your acquaintance, and I hope to work with you again.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad the technology hung in there. So I
Yeah.
was worried about.
We can make it work.
I know you did a good job.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone.